Hello and welcome to the Rare Slot. My name is Rands, and these are the bonus episodes of the Booster Pack podcast. Now, the Booster Pack, that's the show where we unwrap the stories and crack the mysteries of collectible games each and every episode. But here on the Rare Slot, we can take a collectible game-related topic and have a little bit more of a laid-back conversation about it. Whether that's a topic suggested by you guys, something I've come up with, or perhaps just something happening in the TCG or CCG space at the time. Now, today we're going to be talking about collectible games, obviously, but we're going to be talking about the stories that you tell with them and the stories that get told about them. And we have a really cool guest here that is going to be able to share those stories with us, some very unique experiences that not many people have. So I would love to get into that in just a second. But before I do, let me give you an idea of where I'm at starting this conversation. So I believe that every time you play a collectible card game, you are essentially telling a story, whether that's a story of a world-hopping wizard who can sap up the magical energy from the land around them and shoot epic spells at their opponent, or whether that's just as a monster-taming adventurer who can soothe wild beasts and train them to do his bidding. That is something that you're doing with the cards themselves and the rule system meshing together. Now, unfortunately, those two things sometimes have a bit of a juxtaposition and can lead to some pretty janky storytelling. Let me give you an example. So let's say I'm playing some sort of generic CCG and I need to land my final blow. And I play a fearsome lion card. And to give it that little extra boost, I hand it a javelin and have it attack my opponent. And then I've landed victory. And as the basking glow of victory comes over me, I start to realize, I know that that worked mechanically in the game, but how did that work narratively? Did the lion throw the javelin somehow? Like, it doesn't have thumbs. How does it pick it up? And then you get lost in a thought of headcanon and all sorts of craziness. And unfortunately, that's just part of the suspension of disbelief for playing collectible card games. These sort of things come up. But when it comes to telling more long-form stories, what CCG publishers would prefer to do is take the story off the tabletop itself and put it into a more traditional, streamlined, linear medium. So whether that's animated TV series, whether that's online fiction, or perhaps even a comic book series, which sort of brings me to where our guest is today. So let me introduce them before we get too far into this conversation. So our guest today has a little bit of knowledge about storytelling because over 10 years ago today, they published their first story with Marvel Comics. Now, since then, they've become one of the hottest writers at that publisher, putting words in the mouth of top-tier tight-wearing heroes like Daredevil, Doctor Strange, and Spider-Man, just to name a few. But it is probably the most acclaimed runs on Black Cat and Moon Knight that have gotten them affection from comic book readership world over. And as exciting as all that sounds, that's not even why they're here today. In fact, they're here to talk about another comic series they write, one that is by Boom Studios, and it is based on a game that I'm sure anybody watching this show is certainly familiar with, Magic the Gathering. So, here to talk about how they became the writer of the Magic the Gathering comic book and what opportunities and what challenges writing a story about a collectible game-based IP might present is our guest. Welcome to the Booster Pack, the pride of Prince Edward Island, Canada, Jed MacKay. Jed, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm very, very good. Now, to be up forth with the audience, this is our second time recording, and it is hopefully it goes smoothly. So bear with us if there is any technical difficulties, but hopefully that goes all well. So thanks again for joining me.
Oh no, my pleasure.
Now we got into it a little bit last time, but I want to hear it, and I know the audience definitely does, especially after some of those things in the intro. How did you get into writing those comic books, and of course, how did you get writing Magic the Gathering? Tell me what your secret origin is, so to speak.
I've always been, into comics. I think I learned to read by reading comics like, old Tintin stuff, Barks and Don Rosa, Donald Duck stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And as kind of time went on, I, kept being into comics. Like I would read my dad's old comics, then I'd eventually, buy my own comics, and I wanted to make my own comics.
Mm-hmm.
So at first I thought I would write and draw them. I think I was like, 17, 18 or so, and want to do the whole thing. It's gonna be like a real scrappy indie guy.
Mm-hmm.
It became pretty apparent early on that I just wasn't good enough at drawing. I certainly wasn't fast enough. So around the early to mid 2000s, I hooked up with my friend Sheldon, who's an Australian artist. We used to haunt the message boards, the pre social media
Yep.
of the internet at the time. And so we basically partnered up. I would write scripts, he would draw them.
And this is from across the sea, internationally here.
Yeah, I mean, we did most of our work actually when I was living in Korea and he was in Australia, and then later Canada. So it was a real sort of Commonwealth crunch, but we got to figure it out. But anyways, Sheldon got picked up to work for Marvel because he was a much better artist than I was a writer at that time, and a very talented writer stands out, or sorry, artist. Writers do not. Very talented artist stands out, so Marvel picked him up to do some just like anthology work, short stories. And he brought me in to write a story for him because they said we want to team up with an X-Men character and a non-X-Men character. Excuse me. And he's like, I don't know any of these characters. Like, I don't know what to come up with here.
You met a guy in a comic book forum and he didn't know any of the characters from X-Men?
Well, see, the comic book forums we would hang out on were like the scrappy indie ones where, everyone, we were all, through our late teens to our early 20s. So we really kind of like looked down our nose at superhero stuff at that point in time.
The counterculture titles.
Yeah, exactly. We were the, we thought very highly of ourselves. Yeah, so he just didn't have that background. And so that's how I got my first Marvel job. That was around 2010, doing an 8-page X-Men team up. And I thought, well, I've gotten in now. I can get more work. And basically for the next 8 years, I did 16 pages in total for Marvel. Like I wasn't really kicking the doors down or setting the world on fire.
I think that's what they call professionally a slow burn.
So slow as to be more of a sunburn or like whatever you want to call it. Or whatever sort of metaphors you want to mix for it. So about 8 years later, I finally get offered a full issue, full 20 pages, and I was very excited. I did that. From there, I got in doing a digital series, Daughters of the Dragon, and then from that, I had Man Without Fear and Ghost Panther, and gradually just kind of built up my body of work to the point where I had a bit of a name. People like the stuff that I put out with my various collaborators, and up till now where I've quit my day job. I was teaching junior high and also making comic books, but now it's just all comic books all the time.
You've gone professional.
We'll see how wise a choice that is, but it's been going pretty well so far. So
that gets you to Marvel. Now, as I said in the intro, Marvel doesn't publish Magic the Gathering. Boom Studios does. How did that jump across happen?
It was actually during the kind of COVID doldrums when COVID, was just the hot new thing on the scene, and it completely shut down comics distribution in the United States, all of North America. So a lot of series were put on hiatus. I had nothing to do, but I got an email from Amanda LaFranco at Boom Studios, she was my first editor on Magic, saying, Boom Studios, we've got the Magic license. We really want to, try to get out there with a splash. We want to do something really interesting with it. Do you want to write the series? And, I was like, sure. There's other licensed stuff has come up before. I've just never been interested in it because it's just nothing I've had any affection for. But I was like, I really liked Magic when I was younger. I hadn't played Magic for about 20 years at that point because I stopped playing Magic around like 2001. But I was like, yeah, that would be fun. And I also have nothing else going on right now because all my series are on hiatus. And also, she broached it in perhaps one of the smartest ways possible to get a writer on. Is she didn't say anything about my comics, but she said, "Oh, I read the short stories you wrote on your website, and I think it's got the right kind of vibe we want for this comic." I was like, if you're an editor, you want to get to a writer's heart. Tell them that you liked the thing that literally no one reads or likes.
Yeah, I always ask about the thing they don't get asked about. That's some editor advice there.
So yeah, and then basically we're off to the races. I had been out of the game for 20 years. The last set I had bought cards for was Prophecy.
Wow. Okay.
I was pretty far out of the game.
No pun intended.
Oh man, there you go. But I was like, it's whatever. I can catch up with this. Like I work in superhero comics. I catch up on stuff all the time. It's like, how much can the story have changed in 20 years? As it turns out, like a huge amount.
Magic went through a few metamorphoses since 2001.
Yeah. Oh yeah, more than a few. Yeah. Because the first they're like, okay, we want you to use these planeswalker characters. I was like, planeswalkers? Can't planeswalkers like do anything? Like, how the hell do you threaten them? Because I was used to the pre-mending idea of planeswalkers. Your Urzas and your your Mishras, and well, actually, Mishras isn't Planeswalker, but whoever. And I didn't know about like the mending and the kind of power reset and stuff like that. So luckily, a friend of mine from high school who has always kind of had his finger on the pulse in the game was able to act as my consultant as I was kind of trying to put my pitches together. And as I was catching up, like I think I'm in pretty good shape now as far as knowing the lore and what's going on. But yeah, I was caught by surprise there.
For anybody who hasn't read the Boom Studios Magic story there, check it out. Especially if you're an older Magic player, because it feels like a very contemporary story. But there is a couple of nods to the old stuff that I think you might have played way back when, especially in the big bad, so to speak.
Yeah.
So did you do research on, like, did you go back through old books and stuff like that? Did you start playing the game again? How did you sort of refamiliarize yourself with this outside of that friend of yours?
Basically, I just spent a lot of time going through the MTG fandom wiki, which in my Marvel work, I use the Marvel fandom wiki just constantly. Nothing better than just a lot of data crowdsourced and put together and compiled by people who are just like really obsessed with a fandom. So it's been invaluable.
Isn't that just a beautiful life cycle of information? You're creating the story and the fans are refeeding it, and you're creating it and the fans are refeeding it.
Yeah, it's great. And so that was invaluable because, there was a lot to catch up on. There's still some sets I look at them, I kind of scratch my head. I'm like, I don't know. I'm still not really sure what happened there, but it's long enough ago that I don't have to worry about it.
Yeah.
And also I've been collecting the Art of Magic Gathering, the big hardcovers.
They're almost like RPG source books, really. They read like different clans and factions. They're great. People should check them out if they're a Magic fan.
Yeah, they're superb. It's a real bummer that they're the series has been ended, because I was hoping to see more. But I got the Excellent One and the Innistrad and Amonkhet,
Ruby,
and Ravnica, etc. So yeah, that's also been great. And then Wizards would also send me their kind of in-house like design decks, like their portfolios of how they put together a set of like where the story and the idea. So the kind of things they would show artists or people working for them, or
their style guides and stuff.
Yeah. So and those are also great. So that all kind of came together in my crash course over the last year.
Now, that brings us up to sort of how you got into Magic and stuff like that. Now, let's jump back. You sort of mentioned it in there. You used to play all those years ago, and obviously history of collectible games is sort of my wheelhouse. Tell me about your time playing Magic, and did you, little sneaky question here, did you play any other collectible games around the same time as well?
Yeah, so I started playing Magic around the time, like I remember going to Comic-Con back when it was at the bottom of the mall, and buying a starter pack of Ice Age, and I think a couple boosters of 4th edition. So like that was when I started. And I think I brought it up before, but I've got my old card box of various stuff here.
Nice.
Which is still held together by the tape, but you can see.
Oh, what do I see? I see 7th Sea, I see Middle Earth. My God. Oh man, I hope you can get those to table.
Yeah, well, it's funny. Like 7th Sea, like we used to play a lot. I think it was a really solid game.
Hey, there you go.
Then the base layer is Magic, which was always the most popular among all of my gang. And then I've got my old deck, my main deck.
Yeah, Magic seems to be the primordial ooze for many of a CCG sort of fanatic, right?
There's no getting away from it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, when it starts the entire genre, it's really hard not to find some influence from there. And it sort of is, especially in that era, one of the more accessible games from them.
Like, I liked playing 7th Sea a lot, because I really liked the 7th Sea role-playing game at the time. But if I went to a shop to like play with people, odds are they were not playing that. You can go to anywhere, and anybody who's interested in CCGs will have a Magic deck. Magic's
sort of like a blog. Whenever a player falls off another game, they go back to Magic, right?
It's it's just the big dog. It's been around for so long. I think we talked about it last time we spoke, but I found all my like old Inquest magazines and stuff from when I was younger that I thought had been thrown away, and it's wild to be reading them, but also having them talk about Magic being something that had only been around for like 5 or 6 years. And I'm just like, wow, that's wild. Because now it's like, cracking 30 years old.
Yeah, they're referring to sets that were 3 years old as old set.
And, they'd also have coverage of stuff like, the X-Files CCG. And they'd be like, well, the X-Files CCG is, dead now. I'm like, wow, who could have seen that coming?
Exactly.
But yeah, like it's, and that's something that I think that informs my comic a lot. Our Magic comic is my affection for that 90s period of, not just Magic, but just kind of like 90s period of gaming.
By the sounds of it, through Magic, it sort of shaped the way that you spent your hobby time as a kid through all those other games, whether it was Magic or not directly. It definitely had that connection.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I mean, if there's ever a subtle nod in one of the Magic books to one of those other games, you don't have to tell Wizards, but by all means, let me know.
They probably wouldn't consider a dead game competition.
So you've obviously just scored a whole bunch of fans, whether they've read your work or not, on this podcast by flashing some of those classic items there. But we will bring it back to storytelling, but stay in the 90s. Like, let's just dive back into what Magic was doing in the 90s with its storytelling. Did you engage with it? Did you read any of the comic books or anything like that they were putting out at the time?
I didn't read any of the comic books just because they weren't available. I never saw them anywhere. I did. I think we may have talked about this before as well, but had 2 of the short story anthologies, which the names of which I can't remember, but they were great because they're just nothing was nailed down. Like none of the cosmology was figured out. And like none of just how anything works was figured out. So it's just like so loosey goosey, but still a lot of fun. Like, story about the cook whose name I can never pronounce, who Esmeralda Calda. Yeah, that's the story of the Underworld Cookbook, which was, I was very hyped to see it actually pop up for once. The creation of Goblin Rock sleds, and then other stuff that just had like, I don't even know where it came from. I think they just had a random fantasy story. Like, well, we'll throw it in. Sure, why not?
Yeah, if they referenced a couple of card titles, that was good enough for Wizards back then.
So, I mean, that was kind of the extent. Like, we read some of my friends and I would have some like the really early novels, like Arena, I think that one was called, or like one of the green sleeves ones.
Did you ever send away for the cards in the back of them?
No, those they weren't my novels. I borrowed them off my friends.
Right.
But I mean, it was very catch as catch can until Weatherlight hit. And that's the point where they're like, okay, we gotta get our shit together. We gotta actually focus on what this story is going to look like. And I mean, you see the story in every set, but that was the beginning of having that full on story and having that story continue from set to set rather than every set being something different.
Yeah, that's sort of the way that they've done it. It's another one of those ways that Magic has changed over those last 20 years. So I guess my question there is, of course, like, as we're talking about Wizards evolving both, the game itself and the way that they tell stories, how does Wizards impact what you're doing at the moment? Like, do they tell you where they want playing set, or do they tell you what sort of characters to use in the story, or are you sort of given free license? Because I believe the story is a little different from what they're running with at the moment.
My answer is kind of like yes and no, where they're very keen. They wanted the comics to be its own story family. So we're not following the official continuity of the card game. I mean, basically, our real point of divergence is pretty much War of the Spark. Because like by the time I was writing it, I think Zendikar Rising was just coming out. So, and then basically everything after that, we have a kind of pretty broad fork in what's going on.
Yeah, well, that must be good for you not playing catch up.
Well, that's the thing, because there's a set every couple months, and if I have to adjust the kind of canon of the characters that I'm using based on what they did in the set every couple months, that's also really going to screw with my storytelling, given that I'm doing episodes of a story every single month.
And in that, the main characters, especially like the ones you're using, like the Planeswalker characters that you use nowadays, are so fluid between those sets. Like they'll come and go. It would be very hard to sort of get one center character. One set will have Jace, the next one will have Rav or something like that.
But at the same time, it's not something I'm treating as kind of anathema to it. Like, at one point in the future, we reference Kaya and Nico on Kaldheim, where sure, we don't mention that that's ever happened, but there's no kind of downside to referencing that. It doesn't cause a problem because ultimately I'm in control of the continuity of this comic book. So I want to say this is something that happened, before the course of this story or after the course of the story or whatever, then that's fine. It's not a big deal. The interesting thing about it is not being attached to card continuity means I can kind of do whatever I want. I can break as many toys as I want or as I need to.
Put it in other comic book terms, it's sort of like an Elseworld story.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, I think that's what they want to do for any sort of spin-off media from the card game, is to have it be its own story family and have it do its own thing. Just because, like, on the downside, you have the kind of weird concern that comic fans have about things mattering, which actually not just comic fans, now card fans. What people say, oh, is this story canon to the card game? People say no, and they're like, well, I'm not interested. I'm just like, I mean, come on, like, give me a break.
Well, at some point there's a tipping point, like with Marvel, right? It's like, is this canon now? It goes now in the MCU. We have something that's so big that was, an echo of the comics that's now sort of in many people's consciousnesses is the mainline story.
Oh yeah, I mean, that's the thing. Like, someone was talking about my Death of Doctor Strange series on Twitter, and someone replied saying, I can't believe you spoiled a movie that hasn't come out yet. And it's like, no, it's a comic book. It's its own thing. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, they're different universes. Cinematic universe, comic book universe.
Yeah, it's like, I get paid much less for this.
And you have a little bit more control by the sound of it in some instances too.
But also on the other hand, Wizards does have things that they want. They say, here's characters that we'd like to push. Here's characters we'd like to, we're more interested in having this group of characters than this group of characters out there because, they're more popular, they're more marketable. People are more excited about them.
Yeah.
My first outline was basically entirely 90s stuff. Like, to the point where Wizards was like, listen, we got to market this to people who are playing this game now, not people who played this game 20 years ago. So I had Chandler and Joven were in it. They're like Feldegriffs.
There's some ferrets running around.
Yeah, Isan's Shade was hanging out of Castle Sengir.
Yep. Phyrexians still look like they were out of the Gremlins movies.
Yeah, exactly. So that did not fly. But I got my 90s baddie in it, so I'm calling that a win.
Yeah, no spoilers, but definitely check it out. Even if you're an old school Magic fan, there is a way to thread that through. And lastly, the last point I'll sort of make about that sort of stuff, and this goes back to how Wizards has changed over that time. I love the fact that they've adapted their story from sort of this, like you mentioned with these short stories, these epic fantasy stories, similar to like Tolkien novels, to more like what you've been writing with Marvel, like more superhero type stories, where it's sort of like, if the latest episode, not to date this episode, but the latest, issue has sort of characters almost in a Justice League sort of feel or Avengers sort of feel, more on brand.
Yeah. And I mean, that's the thing. It's like it's jumped from a novel story that you pick up and put down to a serialized story. And I don't think that it's any sort of coincidence that you can say the Gatewatch is very much like a superhero team. The Planeswalkers now are very much like superheroes. They have, unlike the more godlike pre-mending Planeswalkers, they have their specific focus thing that they're good at, and their specific powers, which generally makes them more interesting because interesting challenges come from limitations. So they have their exciting, cool powers, but they're also not going to use them to solve every single problem.
It's very interesting as well, and obviously they have such a huge cast of characters that just dropped in the sets because they basically, some of them follow the actual rules of the game. We spoke, I mentioned in the intro, how does telling a story about a collectible game work? Well, in Magic's case, they have legendaries, which are, characters in and of themselves, some of which never get stories. And in your book, a few who I don't think really have had many stories sort of get a little bit of a second tier spotlight. And I love that, obviously. Have you ever wanted to create your own characters for this book, or even your own plane for it, or something like that? Or you're happy to sort of shape these characters who already exist in Wizards' sort of quiver? Currently,
I'm kind of happy to stick with their stable. My first outline had a brand new plane, and Boom told me don't make a new plane. Just, there's so many planes already. Just use a plane that already exists, because it's easy. I mean, it's easier to sell to people. If you present fans of the card game with something that they know, then they're already, they don't need that extra buy-in. So that's why, so much action is set on Ravnica, because Ravnica is basically, Ravnica is to Magic what New York City is to Marvel.
Oh, of course, it's a city, yeah.
Yeah, but it's not just a city; it's the city.
Yeah, it is the center point of it all.
Yeah, it's not like people are clamoring to go see Mercadia, you know?
Although you were playing back then, maybe they will be.
I mean, even I didn't like Mercadia, and you know, I bought the novel.
Oh, right.
But at the same time, my second outline, the big bad, was a new character, and it was a new character that later became, you know, the baddie was going to be a polar kraken planeswalker.
Oh, wow.
Don't make a new planeswalker. Like, there's so many planeswalkers. Just use planeswalkers you already have. I'm like, fine.
I mean, you were going to get pestered. Hopefully, I mean, people don't bother you too much. But now that you've outed that, people are going to hammer you about that, because I'm sure there's some nostalgic fans that would love to see what a polar kraken planeswalker would look like.
I mean, that's what I'm saying. But it wasn't meant to be. But I'm just like, you know, why are planeswalkers all, you know, quadrupeds or, you know, humanoids? Like, who's to say polar krakens don't have an alien form of intelligence that means they can't have a planeswalker spark?
Well, all of them except for Nicol Bolas.
Well, sure. But I mean, I guess he's got 6 limbs. But I mean, honestly, that was probably the most surprising thing catching up on Magic history was Nicol Bolas's glow up. Because even in those old Inquest magazines, Nicol Bolas was a joke.
Well, I mean, if you look at the original 5, he's the only one reading. Everyone else looks badass.
Well, yes. Like, if you're going to tell me that one of those legendary elder dragons became the big bad of the setting, like, I'm thinking Arcades Sableth, or, like, you know, Chromium.
Chromium, I would think.
Not the fat old dragon sitting in an armchair.
Oh man, I'm going to be thinking about that for ages. Maybe you could introduce some of the others in your sort of Elseworld story. So let's talk about sort of just a little bit broader. How, if at all, does writing a story for a collectible game change the way you approach it?
That's kind of the trick, because in superhero comics, there's nothing that people like to do more that is more exhausting than play the games of power ratings, like who can beat who. Which is, you know, a real pain in the neck. I hate it. People ask me questions like, oh, well, in this comic, this person beat this person in a fight, but I don't think that's possible.
And Superman outrun the Flash?
Well, I mean, that's the question. But you know what? Even the best sports team in the world doesn't win every game, you know? But anyways, I digress. That's made it even more difficult when the creatures and characters appearing in the comic actually do have ratings and can be played against one another.
Oh, okay.
It's always been kind of a bit of a struggle to sort of try and play fair with the rules of the game and like the expectations, but at the same time not let that hamstring the storytelling. So, like, you know, we've got our characters, you know, we're working with, you know, Ralzarek, Vraska, and Kaya, and, you know, they're fighting various creatures and baddies and whatnot. But it's always kind of a trick to like make sure that I'm kind of scaling their power level and scaling what they can do, but also at the same time showing that they're planeswalkers who are, you know, the Avengers of the Magic world, and also trying to see the situation there. Because I mean, you know, Vraska's power is that she can turn people into stone, which kind of solves a lot of her problems, given that most of her problems are, I wish this person was dead. You know, and then you balance out with Kai, whose power is turning into a ghost, and Ral, whose power is electrocuting things. So it does present an interesting series of questions, but it's also very useful where anytime I need something to appear in a story, be it, you know, some sort of ghost or some sort of demon or some sort of drake, I just have to go onto a spoilers website or like, you know, the Gatherer website and just type in dragon and see what kind of dragons come up, or like ghosts and see what kind of ghosts come up. And then I can send that right to IG and say, here's the card that's in this scene.
That's awesome. So you can just be like, all right, so I want something on Ravnica. I want it to be a ghost. Let's just choose, this Orzhov thing. That'll be perfect.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, there was in number 7, there's a huge battle in Ravnica and all the guilds were involved. And I emailed IG and like, you know, what, is there anything you want? Is there anything, because IG is a huge Magic player. I was like, is there anything you want to put in this? Because we're kind of emptying out the toy box here. And he's like, I want an Armada Worm. I'm like, done. Armada Worm on the way, bud.
That's fantastic. I think I remember that. It sort of had a bit of an imposing presence on the scene, that's for sure.
Yeah.
And when you see it like that, it sort of disenchants the way that the card game plays sometimes, because you're like, oh, right, they're really that big, because they're always usually just the same pieces of cardboard up against each other.
Yeah, like you've only got an art window that big. But then when you have Also like he's like, I want Rakdos, I want to draw Rakdos. I'm like, all right, we'll put Rakdos in there. Rakdos is immense, and you see him just like clowning these cultists, and they're like, that big compared to him. When you put them on the table, you don't get that sense of scale, which I think is a really interesting opportunity for the comic.
That's awesome. So we've sort of talked about like that power, like balancing that power level and sort of having to justify yourself. You're like, okay, well, if these are all these, proverbial 1/1 zombies, could Kaya take all these people out in one go? And I'm sure, much like, Superman versus the Flash type questions, you're going to get questions like that from Magic players and stuff like that. Do you ever use like things that you would get in the game as sort of plot devices or anything like that? Like I've had a quick look, but like, for example, do you ever use like conventions like mana, like as a consumable resource in your storytelling?
Not really, but part of that is because it's something Wizards kind of wants to shy away from. They're not particularly keen on having card game terms appear in a narrative, which it's fair enough. It just adheres to their sort of style guide. So I think in issue 6, where we go back to the Ice Age 90s, with Jaya Ballard, she the original draft, she's talking about her drawing mana from mountains, because there are like mountains all around her. They're like bursts of volcanic eruptions, and they've like, no, you're gonna have to change that, just because I think the concern there is that too much sort of inside baseball will take people out of the story. And I can see that. That's fair. And also they've been doing this for a long time, so I reckon they know what they're doing as far as their sort of stylistic guides for their fiction.
It's so interesting that that's an evolution that's happened. Like, I mean, if you read the earliest ever Magic story, which is in the Alpha rule book, Richard Garfield wrote like a 2-page story, and it basically is two wizards essentially playing a Magic game, complaining that they can't reach the swamp to get the magic that they need, or complaining that there's not enough forest nearby. And it's interesting that it's taken this evolution, and like you said, Wizards wants to have this IP that can step away from that. But at the same time, I think little nods like that, like I picked up on that Jaya one in that, like I think it was like an ice crater or something like that, and you were saying that she was definitely trying to draw mana, and I saw that nod, and I'm like, oh, that's sort of cute. I think players enjoy that sort of that. Even though it breaks immersion in storytelling, it sort of has a little bit of a wink and a nod to the readers who are most passionate about it, because the most passionate readers of those books are going to be Magic players.
Yeah, I would imagine. And it's funny too, like when the first couple issues came out, I was just looking at reviews to see what people were thinking, and someone's like, "Oh, I was disappointed that there wasn't more sort of reference to how Magic works according to the rules." And like, again, talking about drawing mana from lands, and I was like, I don't know, like, is that a good point? So I texted my friend Tom, who's been helping me out with this, or had been helping me out with this, and I was like, what do you think? He's like, yeah, that's what I want. I want to spend my money to buy a comic that then goes into talking about the stack. I'm like, fair enough. I'll shy away from it then.
That's funny. I have read somewhere once that Wizards officially published a flavorful explanation of how the stack and mana work all together and stuff. So maybe you can look that up. Maybe it's on the wiki or something, and work that into a story.
It's been so long that I don't remember how the stack works. So,
you know what? I think even people who are playing Magic today probably don't remember how the stack works.
I mean, again, I've got about a year's worth of magazines back there, which everyone has a question about how the stack works. So,
yeah, as much as things have changed in those 25 years, some things haven't at all.
Certain things have. Looking at the price guide in the back of those inquests, my word.
Yeah, I did see something recently where even in the last couple of years, you've been able to buy a sports car. Like 5 years ago, you were able to buy a sports car for 6 Black Lotuses. And nowadays, a sports car, you could buy 6 sports cars for a single Black Lotus. So a lot has changed in the last couple of years.
It's wild, isn't it? Like, I mean, I remember like my main deck was basically just a really horrible to play against blue deck. But as part of that, I wanted basically every kind of counterspell that existed. And I was always on the hunt for Force of Will, and I think I got them for like $2.75 a piece, and now they're like worth a lot more than that.
Yeah, almost pushing 3 figures, maybe more than that. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I don't remember how much they were.
Probably just move that decimal place.
Yeah, like these 4 cards that I have could essentially paid for every dollar I've ever spent on any card game.
Well, I mean, that's why I guess, we're going to digress, but that's why investors is such a big conversation topic in our space at the moment. But let's bring it back to storytelling a little bit. So it's so interesting that you mentioned that Wizards wanted to shy away from that again. I was flicking through in preparation for this, some of those old like 90s Magic's comics. And yeah, there is things like, some character is coveting a Black Lotus and stuff like that because it's, the most powerful card or whatever. And in the back, there was actually somebody credited as a games rule consultant.
Oh, interesting.
Actually, in fact, coincidentally, it was one of the previous guests of this show, Sean Carnes, was credited. So he was obviously a consultant by the storyteller. So obviously that role doesn't exist anymore.
No, I mean, like we have our liaisons with Wizards, but as far as direct rule sort of translation, it's just not something they're really interested in doing anymore.
Yeah. But obviously they're still going to keep their maybe not so much the rule stuff, but maybe like obviously their flavorful continuity. Like they're not going to have somebody like Chandra casting a counter spell or something like that in your book.
No, and I mean it's interesting because what they're more focused on, and I think it's a good angle, is they're less about the mechanics of the game, but more about the sort of emotional and philosophical states represented by the color pie. And I think that's a useful way to look at it, where if you have a blue aligned character, we have certain expectations from them in the same way we have expectations for a red aligned character, or your Magic mixes. And I think that's an interesting sort of set of archetypes to use in telling these stories. And I think that's a useful way to reflect those mechanics in narration or in a narrative without it being, like I said, too much inside baseball.
Well, it's so interesting. And I guess for a writer who's being handed a set of characters, obviously something you're familiar with writing superhero comics, but these ones, like you said, do almost have like a personality blueprint when you go and look at whatever colors that make up that card or that planeswalker or that legendary character or anything like that.
Yeah. And that's, one of the reasons why I chose the characters I did to work with is, all the colors represented. Vraska is black green, Kai is black white, and Ral is blue red. And try to use those ideas to influence how I write the characters and how I characterize them and the choices that they make.
It's really interesting to see that sort of come out because like you said, if you need somebody to be angry in the moment, you've got somebody there. If you need someone to be smart or say something clever, who to lean on and how to lean on it. Like your characterization of Rav and stuff like that. He's sort of like he's an eccentric genius. Like I love that sort of stuff in the way that it plays in Magic as well.
And it's interesting, Ravnica is a great example of that. In all the guilds are, 2-color guilds. That's why you have 10 of them. And they're the sort of expression of the combined ideas or combined philosophies of those colors, I think is really interesting. And that's something, when I was first told of Ravnica, I didn't like it. And again, this is, some years ago, 5 or 6, 7 years ago, and actually way more than that. And it was whenever it came out. And I was like, well, this just kind of sounds like, a rip off of Planescape or something like that, because I didn't actually know about it and I was just being ornery. But the more I read into it, the more interested I was in it, because I think it's just such an interesting way to create these these guilds, where some of them make a little less sense than others. I still haven't quite got my head around what the Gruul are doing in Ravnica, but at the same time, I think the guilds where it works, it really works. The ones I really like, I think, are just really good expressions of those color mixes.
That's exactly right. And like you said, you can always find that balance in sort of Ravnica's, because Ravnica is more or less by its nature the perfect expression, not only just of the color pie, but the color pie mixes as well. So I think that's a really good way to look at that. So let's just ask a little bit of a question here. Just came to mind about, like, as I said in the intro, collectible games sort of have a storytelling element to the way that you actually even play them. So characters are going to be like mixed together in various decks, and certain cards are going to work better together and everything like that. Are you intimidated? Or do you ever think about the fact that people are sort of almost playing like these characters like they're their own toys and mixing them together in their own way? Do you ever consider that? Like, do you ever consider anything that what is a popular deck archetype or anything like that? Or should I put this character next to this character or anything like that, because they work well together in the game and that's the expectation of the players?
No, not really. I mean, I'm so far out of the meta that I don't know what is good anymore. Um, you know, I was told that you can't have counter spells in decks anymore. They stopped printing them. I was kind of blew my mind. That's basically what I spent all my time on is counter spells. Um, so yeah, no, that's not really a concern of mine. Just given I'm just so far out of it that I wouldn't know what I was talking about.
It's really interesting to see that. Like, there is something I did find really interesting in actually, again, not to date it too much, but in the latest issue, I quickly read it before this interview, and you did make reference to it's going back to sort of gameplay. There was I don't want to spoil it too much, but there is a plot thread that sort of nods at token making in the game. Like small characters or small creatures and stuff like that plays this sort of thing into the plot elements. And obviously, if those characters were all in a little token makey deck, you could sort of see that connection there, and sort of like a nod to the audience.
I'm not going to say that was something I was waiting for people to pick up on, but it was something that's kind of on my mind. But narratively, it also works. If we're talking about artificial creatures created to serve the guilds, you have the weirds, the thralls, which I was so pleased to see thralls coming back. One of my goals at some point is to go back to Sarpedia, because I liked Fallen Empires, and I love the fact that Sarpedia is just packed to the gills with thralls who are too dumb to cross the water and destroy the rest of the world. But it's like basically a ticking time bomb.
With that sort of carte blanche that you almost you have on the storytelling, you can sort of take it back there. And I think there's, with things like they do a lot of like supplementary sets nowadays that sort of nod back to those ages and stuff. So those characters and those elements are still very vibrant in the card game itself in the modern day.
Yeah, I mean, like, I'm not saying Wizards will do it, but I would like to do it in our comic book if I get the chance. But yeah, I mean, again, it's always kind of my hankering to go back to the 90s.
I think we all have a little bit of that in us somewhere. Okay, so let's sort of wrap it up here. I do have a couple last little questions. So as somebody who was a previous Magic player, and like you said, you had a passion for the brand, and that was why you're interested in doing this tie-in title, and now somebody who's a professional sort of comics writer, and somebody who has experience doing this, what, like, if you can sort of, from a player to a writer, like between those two things, can you sort of tell, what do you think the best way to tell a collectible card game story is? Do you think it's like this in Magic, where it should be sort of removed from the game entirely, sort of thematically similar but different? Or do you feel like that the cards should tell the story and obviously, sort of try and tie to that as much as possible?
I mean, honestly, I think the best way to tell a story is through comic books that I write.
That's no bias or anything.
Yeah, no. I mean, honestly, I think Wizards is doing a pretty good job of kind of like having their cake and eating it too, where they've got their short stories on their website. They seem to, which it's got to be a lot easier for them than putting novels out. But then at the same time, they're exploring, this kind of the multimedia franchise aspect of the property, and I think they're kind of getting the best of both worlds. As long as these things are successful, which the comic's not canceled yet, which is pretty good for most comics. I just finished writing issue 13. We got issue number 9 just came out, which was just about finishing our first big arc. But I mean, it's hard for me to say because I can't really think of any other collectible card games that exist that have a story anymore. Because like, what card games are there anymore? Like Pokemon, Yu-Gi-Oh, are those still around?
Yeah. So, I mean, you may end up hearing about it eventually, but there's a couple others that have started to pop up, things like Flesh and Blood and stuff like that, which all have sort of stories, I guess, told through online fiction, which is a very common way to do it. And back in the 90s, I guess there was different ways to tell the stories. Like, I mean, like you showed Legend of the Five Rings there, which had very famous way of telling a story where it would lean on tournament results and things like that to sort of decide what was going to happen next, and tell stories through fan magazines and all that.
Yeah, I mean, like I was reading the Inquest where they're covering that tournament. There's a picture of John Wick tearfully tearing up the Evil Wins envelope.
That's fantastic. That's the Day of Thunder, yeah.
I don't know. I've heard people kind of like bitch and moan about that, but I remember reading that when I was younger, and I thought it seemed like the coolest thing in the world, where that people playing the game would have a hand in determining how the story goes, to a certain extent, and it seemed like really interesting to me. And 7C did that I think Rage started to do that just before it got canceled.
Yeah, they were all sort of in that same wheelhouse of the same company making them. So yeah, they all started to lean that way.
Which is also interesting because you had the licensed card games that just had no story whatsoever. I mean, there was no story to Star Wars because the story was already done.
Yeah. Well, the sets followed the story of the movie. They had to be like, well, this scene has to be in this set because it's this. Yeah.
There's like, the Dagobah expansion and then the Cloud City expansion, etc. But also, like, there was no surprises there. Like, you knew what was going to happen.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, I don't know. I wonder if we ever see another boom in collectible card games, if it's going to be strictly online, because it seems to be, Arena seems to be doing quite well as far as I know. People seem to be talking about playing it a lot, especially during a pandemic. So yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, I mean, obviously, you're definitely not a world that you're involved with. There's something that's obviously very close to me. The collectible card games are sort of in our own community going through a bit of a renaissance of sorts. There's a new game, as I mentioned, Flesh and Blood, that is sort of almost entered the market as almost an original CCG for the first time in years. That wasn't, a Japanese import or something like that. That comes out of New Zealand, and it is starting to get a lot of traction. It's in almost every game store, like Magic is and stuff like that. And there's sort of other games sort of getting on this bandwagon, and there's sort of like indie.
Even Richard Garfield had a new game recently, didn't he?
Well, he just brought out. Just previously he had Keyforge, and then just brought out Soulforge.
Yeah, I mean, I know nothing about it other than the fact that Richard Garfield had a new game, which I was like, this should be bigger news, I would think.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah, there's a sort of like pseudo collectible games. They come like the decks are already pre-built, but they're through an algorithm, which is very Richard Garfield.
He's never found a bit of math he couldn't throw at a problem he didn't like.
Yeah, as combinatorial mathematics goes, he's definitely got that down. Yeah, so that's pretty much it. I mean, I guess wrapping up, as we just talked about, there is this sort of new generation of collectible card game makers coming along. Like, I come from a film background, and I always consider this particular era sort of like the film school generation of collectible card game creation, because they grew up on things like Magic and Pokemon, and they're sort of starting to refine it and do the things right that they did. Back in the 90s, everyone was sort of flying blind in those games in that box. There was a lot of mistakes made and stuff. And now we're coming into this new era where a lot of Kickstarters are reaching $1 million US for trading card games and stuff like that. And they're all original properties. So this might be a new wave of that. And what advice would you give as somebody who has played collectible card games and again is writing a collectible card game story? Like, what do you think that the best delivery system, whether that's a comic book or, as you said, one maybe written by you, or whether it's the card game or whether it's a TV show, like how would you as a CCG player most like to engage with the story that way?
Honestly, my kind of my instinct goes to the original. It goes to old Magic, where I think that was one of the things I liked. Not one of the things I liked most. I liked playing games. I liked annoying people with my terrible blue deck.
Yeah, we don't like you.
Yeah, I like the flavor text, because it was like putting a puzzle together. You recognize names, you recognize places, you start to kind of trying to figure things out. And I think the standalone sets, especially Ice Age and Visions, Mirage and then Visions, obviously. That was was really interesting to me to see like who are these characters are and like what are they getting up to, like what kind of story are we learning from this, because it wouldn't tell you everything, but it would tell you enough to get you interested. And I think that's kind of the key, is to kind of whet the appetite, bait the hook, and leave them wanting more.
So yeah, leave room for the flavor text. It's like you said, putting a piece of the puzzle together. They sort of hit on it with their third expansion, Antiquities, where it was all basically it was a puzzle piece of story flavor text and stuff. And things like Sparcadia, we mentioned before, was all told through flavor text on those Homelands cards in different volumes and stuff. So the original way is the best way sometimes.
I would say that I think it's effective, specifically because to this day I'm still looking up stuff that I remember to say, well, what was that actually all about? And that's the long con. Like it works.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. Sometimes Magic cards, especially from back then in that Ice Age era, had random names like Marit Lage, or things that were even spelt backwards.
Or like Feldergriff was a anagram of Richard Garfield, PhD.
Exactly, right. So there was all these little things that sort of stuck with you because they were like, what was Llanowar? Nobody knew for years and years, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So that pretty much brings us to the end. Now, obviously, because of what you showed off before, you've got to tell me just before we go, without other than Magic the Gathering, what was your favorite classic collectible card game?
I think it's got to be 7th Sea. I think that's the one we got the most play out of. like I said, I was a big fan of the role playing game. So when the card game came out, it was a no brainer. And yeah, it's probably the one we played the most after Magic, because I remember it having a pretty good system. But again, you're pretty forgiving to things when you're like 15. So it's been I wouldn't mind cracking it out again, but just to kind of see how it holds up still.
Yeah, I mean, it does have a very loyal following. It's it's a small scene, but it's definitely people love that game still, and occasionally I get a chance to talk to them, engage with them in this community and stuff like that. It was such a cool game, and AEG was such a great company as far as like fan-centric stuff goes. We talked about that storytelling before, and we talked about they license their things so people could make their ship cards like actually out of wood and stuff. It was very, very cool.
Yeah, it was a cool game, and like we mentioned before, I have a lot of affection, like a sort of late in life obsession on the On the Edge card game, which I have a fair amount of, and no one to play with. But it's one of the things I found interesting in that time period is, here's a semi-successful role-playing game franchise. Let's spin a card game out of it, like like Shadow Fist, Doomtown, Seventh Sea No Quarter, On the Edge from Over the Edge.
Over the Edge, yeah. Or even the Wizards ones, like, you've got obviously Vampire the Eternal Struggle, which was Vampire the Masquerade, and Battletech, and obviously Netrunner, which was Cyberpunk.
Yeah, Arcadia, and Arcadia from Changeling.
Yep, of course, yeah, which is behind me here. Yeah.
The widely reviled Spellfire, the D&D one.
Yeah, of course, right? Like, had the creator of that on, and he's a character. That was a fun time.
I'm kind of I'm telling tales out of school, given how much the magazines I read at the time bagged on Spellfire. I've never actually played or owned any Spellfire cards.
It was definitely the kicking mule of Inquest and stuff like that.
Yeah.
That's very funny. All right, well, let's wrap it up there. Otherwise, we could spend another 6 hours talking about those games in that box there. So thank you so much for joining me, Jed. Goodbye from you.
Oh, yes. Well, yeah, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it, and hope your viewers enjoyed the show.
Excellent. Thank you so much for joining me and telling me all about this. And now we're going to have to talk for another couple of hours just about that box there. All right, thank you so much for joining me for another episode of the bonus Booster Packs Rare Slot episode. Until next time, catch you later. Keep shuffling. And there you have it, our episode with comic book writer and, as we learned during the episode, collectible card game player of yesteryear, Jed MacKay. Thank you so much, Jed, for sharing those stories. And thank you guys for joining us on this episode. Now, be sure, if you want to, check out Jed's comic book, that is Magic the Gathering by Boom Studios, or anything he's done with Marvel. And you can find his social media linked in the description. Now, also, Jed and I touched on a bunch of old school collectible card games that I'm sure some of you are familiar with. But if you're not, and you're interested in starting a collection, or you want to fill out a collection you already have going, be sure to check out category1games.com. You'll find them linked in the description, and they have great customer service and a huge selection of competitive prices in the market that you can get a collection started, even if a game's been out of print for years and years. Check them out there. Now, as for me, I have been Rands, and you can find me via social media. That is twitter.com/CCG History. I'm very active there. Or on Facebook, which is facebook.com/CCG History. A little less active in that realm, but you can still get me there as well. Both DMs are open, so if there's anything you want to say, you can send that to me. Or if you'd prefer, you can send an email to theboosterpack@ccghistory.com. Plus, have a look in the description if there's any feedback you have for the show, or if there's anything you want to see specifically on the show, because we have a survey link for our listeners. You can let us know when you started playing games, what games you want to hear about, if there's any creators you want to hear from, or if there's any topics you want to hear discussed. Find that all linked in the description. So that's it for me. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of The Rare Slot. And as always, I will repeat myself at the end of these episodes. Until next time, keep shuffling.